posted up on website. Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kirsten Cather. I'm the director for the Center for East Asian Studies here at UT Austin. I'm really delighted to be co-sponsoring this talk with my colleagues in the South Asia Institute. It's our first joint event, so it's a lovely inaugural event for us. And I'd really like to especially thank Scott Webble from South Asia Institute, who was instrumental in organizing and coordinating this book discussion of Joy Ma and Dilip D'Souza's book. I forgot to ask you how to pronounce this, the Deoliwallahs. Hopefully I did not butcher. The true story of the 1962 Chinese-Indian internment. And this was published by Pan Macmillan in 2020. We have posted the link to the Amazon copy, which is where you can purchase it because it's an international publication, in the chat box. Both authors today are joining us from afar. Joy Ma is currently in San Francisco, and she'll be sharing the story of India's internment of 3,000 Chinese Indians for sometimes as long as 5 years in the early 1960s during the Sino-Indian War. For many of us, this is a little known or completely unknown story, while for her it was a foundational one, as she was one of a handful of children who were born in the internment camp. She's joined today by her co-author, the prize-winning writer, Dilip D'Souza, who has lived all over the globe, including Austin, Texas, for many years. So we welcome him back virtually today. And he comes to us today virtually from Bombay. Finally, we are also very lucky to have as discussant today, Professor Lina Chhun, who just last year newly joined us at UT Austin. She's in the Department of American Studies. Her work on historical violence, war, militarism, and racial disposability in the context of US Cold War in Southeast Asia, I think is an especially welcome lens for us to consider today's talk. So we're very grateful to all these participants for sharing this story, particularly in these times where otherness is often targeted, cordoned off, erased by omission or by force. As I was reading the book over the past couple of days, I realized this story is both extraordinary in every sense of the word and entirely too ordinary in our world. Thank you again all. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Joy Ma, who's going to speak first for a bit and share a presentation with us, and then to Dilip, and then to Lina for some discussion. And then we're going to leave lots of time for question and answer. And we welcome all of you to participate vigorously in that Q&A and to even turn on your cameras at that point if you feel comfortable doing so. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. So I will share my screen. I'll give it a minute. Okay, I'll try to present this. Okay, not sure if it's presenting. Okay, here we go. So one of the things I thought, based on the many talks we've had is, and for people reading the book, and especially if they're not from India, the sense of space and like, who are these people? Where did they go from? It doesn't really paint a picture in their heads. So put together this presentation to augment that. And so this is the book. The book is called the Deoliwallahs, and Deoli was the town where the internment camp was. So referring to it as Deoli Internment Camp, and Wallahs are the people. So, and it's a story that very few people have heard about, whether you come from India or you're not from India. So just wanted to share a quote from Pratap Bhanu Mehta, a very well known academic and writer, and it's really about the forgotten chapter. It's a story that has been buried and just shoved under the carpet by administrators. And so when we actually talk to some administrators, they say, oh, it's very sad, and then they move on. This is us, and I've spent too much time. I finished college in Delhi, and then I came to New York to study, and I've been here since then. So what are we talking about? So there was a war about contesting the border between India and China in 1962, and the line was drawn by the British government. The line was never really agreed upon by the representative of China at that time. And so it had never been resolved. And then it just kept on progressing further and further. And then there was this border incursion. And when the war was over, the very next day, there was a very organized internment of it was, how should I put it? It was coordinated across many areas. And that's what we term as the general internment. And that happened in November 17th, 1962. And 3,000 Chinese were rounded up from the eastern areas, generally the eastern areas where there was a concentration of more Chinese Indians. And they were taken to this disused World War II POW camp in Rajasthan. Deoli is not too far away from Jaipur. Everyone knows where Jaipur is, but the closest big town was called Kota. And so where did these people come from? I talked about it a little bit, and they came from around this area, right? So all the eastern area, Northwest Bengal was a very, very big area from which people were rounded up. So we'll give you a little closer look. And so people were taken as far as like the furthest, almost the furthest reaches of Eastern India, Tinsukia, Makum. And, later on they were taken from Shillong, a little bit further inland here. And they were taken all the way across to Rajasthan right here. It was depending on when you started, depending on how many stops and how much time they waited to gather people, it could be a week-long journey. Actually, the train ride itself probably took 3 or 4 days. So they went across from the area that they were very familiar with, like really tropical area, tea gardens, verdant area to Rajasthan. And the surprising thing is the people in those days, you don't have so much communication. So when they landed in Rajasthan, a lot of the officials and the people processing them, like the police, they thought they were just getting a bunch of Chinese who would not know the language or would not know anything. So when they were being registered, they were actually shocked to hear them speak in Hindi. And I don't know whether they shared that actually all these folks had been born in India, and all their children were actually second generation Indians. And so here is, okay, move this a little bit. So here's Kota, and then Deoli is right here. So we were, my parents and my brothers were brought here, and then they were bused from here to here. And then, as I mentioned, Jaipur is right here. Like a little more clear insight here. There, this is where we landed up. So what did it look like? It was, these photos are taken in 2012 when one of the ex-internees who was a teenager, he was about 15, 16 or 13 when he went here, and he went back and he took a trip. So these are the barracks, each family had like about this much, and then this was another house, and then, so they were like, they lived together, alongside each other, and each family had its own rations, and essentially they were just living there. Oops, okay. So here's another look at what it looks like. Arid, they had water supplies, but it was just, like some very disused at the time. People died there, and so here's a photo of the cemetery. And so prior to the internment of the Chinese Indians, there were POWs from World War II, Japanese and Italian POWs. After we got there, there were some prisoners from Pakistan as a result of the war in '65. And then before before World War II, probably before World War II, there were a lot of Indian freedom fighters who were also imprisoned in the camp, and one of them was Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a PM at the time when the internment happened. So I think that brings us to the end of this presentation. I wanted to read a little chapter. A lot of this book is actually all the book is my mother's. My mother's a big inspiration. She remembered, and all our mothers remember their lives, but this one was quite incredible, and she always wanted me to write the book, and I eventually wrote it, but it was very, very difficult to write it because you live under the shadow of the camp, and it's just difficult to break through. So I'll read a little bit of the chapter of my mom and dad. It's chapter 11, if you were to read the book, and the chapter title is Assa and Jack Ma, This Side or the Other. One day in 2017, when I was talking to my mother, we started arguing. I was referring to former Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri during one of our conversations about a book, and she corrected me saying that he was the Home Minister. We went back and forth arguing about his title until I realized that the change had happened when she was interned in Deoli. And she never knew that since his visit to Deoli Camp, Shastri had become Prime Minister. Caught completely off guard, tears welled up as I wept silently, again for the hopeless years Mom and my family had lost, and for finally understanding why Shastri's visit to Deoli was so unforgettable for Mom and for many others in the camp. It was heartbreaking for me to see how she realized that there was even more she had missed during her long years in Deoli. She didn't speak for a while. Shastri's visit to the camp in 1963 was a story I had been told so many times by different people that I felt I knew it very well. I felt connected to Shastri because when I was in high school, I won second place in the Lal Bahadur Shastri short story writing contest. I already knew of his visit to Deoli, and there seemed to be a reason that my story broke through the thousands of entries in the contest created in his honor. It was, by the way, a pretty bad science fiction story about haunted twins, which is thankfully lost because our class teacher misplaced it. On June 9th, 1963, after a second batch of internees left for China, Home Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri visited the camp. Mom remembers him as a man of medium height who was soft-spoken. A crowd of internees had gathered to listen to him, hopefully that a man of such high standing in the government finally visiting the camp would bode well for their situation. Mom and Dad stood at the back of the crowd. Over a loudspeaker, Shastri spoke about the plan for the internees and that those who chose to stay would be returned to their homes. He asked those who wanted to stay in India to stand on one side and those who wished to go to China to stand on the other. The people who wanted to go to China would board the last ship, one that was yet to arrive. The effect of his words was electrifying. Everyone started talking at once. Astonishment rippled through the crowd as they dared to hope, after being banished to a place that they themselves had never heard of until they arrived, for what they had only imagined as an impossible, unattainable choice, to go back to their homes. The internees eagerly sorted themselves, standing where they wanted to, establishing undrawn lines. My dad's face lit up. There was only one thing he wanted from the few options presented to him, and that was to pick up his life from where he had left it. He and my mother stood on the India side. After the internees had taken their sides, Shastri thanked them and promised that those who chose to remain in India would be sent to their homes to go back to their lives and livelihood. The rest would board the last ship to be, in quotes, repatriated to China. For years, my mother had spoken of his visit and how nothing happened. The memories of those who tell me the story are clear and their disappointment tangible. For Mom, I could tell that she saw our continued internment after that visit as a broken promise, she never forgot how excited the people around her were when they were offered the chance to remain in India. So many people wanted to go back to their homes and carry on their lives. And she always asked, how could the Home Minister promise to send us back and fail to deliver? How could he bring so much hope to the most forgotten people in the world and not know what he was doing? What could make him break such a promise and in doing so break people's hearts? Looking back, I realized the gaps in our knowledge were because we received little or no news in the camp. Newspapers were censored and full of holes, barely held together by razor-thin strips of newsprint. When she got out of Deoli, she had to struggle so much that following a politician's career was the last thing on her mind. Years after she was released, she learned Shastri had died a few years after the visit, but didn't know that it happened when he was the Prime Minister. In January 1966, 3 years after my family was interned, Lal Bahadur Shastri died in the Soviet Union, the day after signing the Tashkent Declaration to end the 1965 war with Pakistan. So that was why Mom didn't know for more than 50 years that he had become Prime Minister. With that, I will turn it over to Dilip.
Thank you, Joy. I'd like to also just thank the University of Texas, Kirsten and Lina and Scott for having us here. And as you mentioned, Kirsten, it's a homecoming of sorts for me to return to Austin, city I loved a great deal, and I would love to come back for a real visit at some point. Since Joy spoke a lot about Shastri, I want to read you a little bit from the book about Shastri. Just for those who don't know, Shastri was Prime Minister for a year or two, I can't remember exactly, in the 1960s, after the death of Jawaharlal Nehru. And he was Home Minister under Nehru and then became elevated to Prime Minister when Nehru died, or after Nehru died. So, and then in 1963, he visited the camp, as Joyce said, and here's a little passage of what happened next. So in August that year, there was a discussion about the internees in the Rajya Sabha, which is our upper house of parliament. J.S. Pillai, member of parliament, asked how many internees at the Deoli camp had, quote, refused to go to China. The Minister of State for Home Affairs, that's Shastri's deputy in a sense, R.M. Hajarnavis, told him 595. Were they prepared to go to Formosa, which was the name for Taiwan? Asked Pillai. No, they wanted to remain in this country, he was told. So how many detainees were there in the camp altogether, Pillai asked. 1,654 plus 595, that comes to 2,249, he was told. Another MP then asked about these 595. Were they refusing to go to China because that country's government, quote, has been following international gundaism, perfidy, and all that sort of thing. Gundaism is a very Indian word for thuggery, you might say. Home Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri answered, saying he had not discussed exactly this question with the prisoners, but he had inferred that the present policy of the Chinese government is not acceptable to them, and they were, quote, happy to remain in India, which was, quote, a free country and had a democratic setup. Now, Shastri was speaking, we have to assume, from personal experience because he had just returned from a visit to the camp. He told the Rajya Sabha the internees that he met there were, wait for this, quote, exceedingly happy. Especially, I found the women and children fully satisfied with the arrangements made and the facilities provided in the camp. The last Chinese-Indian prisoners were released from Deoli Camp in 1967. That's Joyce and her family. 5 years after they entered, 4 years after Lal Bahadur Shastri found them exceedingly happy in the camp. So that's Shastri for you. I want to read as a follow-up to that of sorts. Just a little bit from right at the end of the book, just a page, because I think this is what I feel is what Deoli has done to us in a sense, what this whole incarceration has done. The incarceration made it acceptable for many Indians to give voice and legitimacy, perhaps, for the first time since independence, to our deepest prejudices. Call it the euphoria of freedom, call it the influence of Jawaharlal Nehru's moral authority, if you like. But there was a sense in those early Indian years that such prejudices should stay hidden, that there was a certain opprobrium attached to its open expression, a sense, in a word, that sentiments like this were wrong. But with the 1962 war, a feeling had spread across the land of a great betrayal by China, and that too after we had so often extended a hand of friendship. To the average Indian, it wasn't some faceless foreigners who were responsible. It was the, quote, slant-eyed people of our giant northeastern neighbor, easily recognized anywhere. Hatred for them came just as easily. Seamlessly, it made the leap to slant-eyed people who lived within our borders. Who would stop to ask why they too should be blamed for the betrayal? Who would question the suspicion directed at them? So to the average Indian, it seemed only natural that Indian authorities would take some official punitive action against this enemy within. And abusing them on that train, throwing stones at it, vandalizing their homes and businesses, all this was only natural too. In fact, it was even patriotic. No longer would we hide these thoughts. No longer were these thoughts wrong. This is the legacy of 1962. In every hateful stereotype expressed about one or the other community today, every murderous attack on members of a different religion, every call to go to Pakistan, every unthinking use of words like chinki and kalia. Kalia is a word for, which literally means black. You know what that would indicate. Every unthinking use of words like that, you can trace roots that stretch back over half a century to that prison camp in Deoli. We don't realize it, but this is what Deoli has done to us. So that's all I really wanted to say. Lina, I would love to take part in any back and forth that you have for us.
Hi, thank you. Thank you both so much, Joy and Dilip. So, of course, I also want to thank Scott, Kristen, the Center for East Asian Studies, and the South Asian Institute for having me here, and special thanks to Joy and Dilip for taking the time to be here. And I really appreciated this opportunity to read this incredibly beautifully layered account of this 1962 Chinese-Indian internment at Deoli. And personally, this was not a historical event I was aware of before reading the book, which is not unlike some of what you both kind of discussed at the beginning in the premise. I know, Dilip, you were talking about writing about the, this internment at several points, and being really kind of taken aback by the fact that there was like a scarcity of those who actually knew about this event in India. And then of those who did know of the event, this kind of, sort of pragmatic sense, or viewing it with this sort of pragmatic, like this is an issue of national security, right? And that particular logic is certainly not just specific to India. But, I think the book makes many interventions and engages in many different fields and asks them, importantly, some incredibly important questions, especially in our contemporary moment. These discussions around citizenship and the nation, diaspora, and, this idea too of like newly formed nation states. In the case of India, sort of the newly formed post-colonial nation, post-independence, and with China too, sort of, this nation that it's formed after years of sort of imperial domination from Japan, and then obviously too a different kind of colonial domination with with Great Britain and other European powers, as well as this history of civil war. And so sort of regionally, right, there is so much happening in terms of geopolitical dynamics, and then questions of trauma, both sort of historical trauma, but also personal trauma, and these various, like I said, histories of violence, sort of bringing all of this together in a way that's quite layered, colonial, imperial, as well as regional. histories that produce both the, the Chinese-Indian War of 1962, especially like those questions around territorial disputes, something that we continue to see happening in the world today, which we can certainly talk about, and but also in terms of like Deoli itself and the kinds of racial and ethnic logics around citizenship that produce this particular incarceration. So I think the book does such an incredible job of weaving together these historical contexts and geopolitical considerations, along with these really personal and familial stories in a very sensitive way of those who survived the camp, as well as the generation of folks still very much affected by the Deoli incarceration. What I found most poignant personally in those interweaving of stories is that those stories center not only the period of internment in the camp, but also the devastating effects of Deoli long after, right? So both the personal effects on individuals and families, which we oftentimes don't think about, the sort of long reach of, these events of historical violence, but also the kind of historical, Dilip was just saying, right? Like these historical afterlives and the ways in which we continue to see resonances of Deoli in our contemporary moment, certainly in India, but also the ways in which this happens, right, in history generally. And so I think that, this capturing of both the context, but also the long legacy of Deoli is so important. And also this sort of like referencing to different kinds of violence, whether it's the sort of epistemological violence, the forgetting, that historical forgetting of Deoli that we see is produced by, among other things, sort of this official narrative by the Indian government of the betrayal from China, that kind of official narrative, sort of notions of the like bodily counts and like this sort of hierarchy of oppression that sometimes comes up when talking about concentration camps, and then sort of psychological violence of actually being detained and in some ways criminalized simply because of one's profile, in this case looking Chinese. The really complicated feelings of shame and betrayal and anger and sadness that we continue to see with individuals and families. And so, there's a couple of general questions I have, which I'll send over to Dilip and Joy to see what you all think. I also have some more specific questions related to passages in the text itself, which I may come back to depending on time at the very end. But so there's three sort of general, three general issues I was really interested in hearing the two of you talk about. And I think, in some ways you talk about this in the preface, that the narrative, the narrative arc of the book feels incredibly organic to me, which I think is one of its more, for lack of a better word, innovative, or, I think there's something in that structure. Regarding that division of labor you two have in the collaboration of producing this book, right? Like the ways in which the chapters are alternating between this really important historical and geopolitical context, alongside these, these very, personal stories that include like these moments of these details from everyday life, right? So the sort of juxtaposing of those things together. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that kind of experience of doing this work collaboratively, how that came about, what that process felt like. So that's one of the general questions. Another is maybe perhaps not as general, but I am curious. So I know, Joy, you talked about this at the beginning, how Deoli is the place, and then Walla refers to a group of people. And so how you mentioned this, I think, in chapter 8, and then you talk about sort of the birth of this term in the Yin Marsh, I think, chapter. But it'd be great to hear a little bit more about the significance of the title, the Deoliwallahs, and maybe what it might mean to center maybe an identification with the camp, and maybe really complex or ambivalent tensions there. And so the last thing is in terms of like the interviews themselves, which I'd love to hear from both of you. So like I mentioned before we got started, my own research has required conducting oral histories with Cambodian survivors, including my own family members of the Cambodian Holocaust in 1975 to 1979 during the Pol Pot regime. And those oral histories also included sort of pre-Cambodian Holocaust, and then also the effects afterwards, because there was also a civil war in Cambodia before the Cambodian Holocaust. And I myself was actually born in a refugee camp on the border of Cambodia and Thailand when my family fled. When my family fled Cambodia en route to the U.S. And so there are two kind of camp experiences too in my own sort of personal familial history. And this is a question that's ongoing for me, how to ask these questions in a way that's respectful. There's an incredibly difficult question of how to represent these stories of violence. And I think you do that so beautifully, Joy. I think that, your choices, especially to both tell the stories, but also include, I know in Yuva's chapter, right, you include at length her own words. And then the article for the chapter on your mother, where you include pretty at great length, what came from the original article that sort of began the project. And so I'd love to sort of hear a little bit more about just that process of interviewing survivors. I know you also, towards the end, talk about your experiences with survivors as well, Dilip, and that story you tell at the end about Paul in the text messages he was getting was so, I'm still sort of processing it. I'm not quite sure what to think about it, but just that experience. What was that experience like for any of for both of you? And I guess the last general question I have here was just sort of in terms of you both talk at length about parallels to Japanese internment in the U.S. and I think thinking through Deoli in a comparative sense, like how can we sort of think through Deoli in conversation with things like Japan, but also something that struck me as I was reading the book was like this very interesting reaction when folks hear this story is like, but this is not like the Nazis, and that I think is a very interesting kind of politics, which we can also speak to if folks are inclined to do so. So I guess I'll open that back up to Joy and Dilip if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lina. So I can get the conversation started about our collaboration, my collaboration with Dilip, and I recommend it to everybody to work with an amazing collaborator. I've just, it's writing is such a kind of a lonely project, and so for me, it was wonderful writing it. The topic is huge, so it was overwhelming for me to do everything, and Dilip came at it from a point of view of like not knowing about it till around 2012, right? So that's around like already 50 years. And here's a person who's really, well informed. And so since I was like the baby of the group, my family was known to a lot of people in the camp. But the type of the attitude people sometimes have is, did you know so and so and so? And the camp wasn't a really like highly socialized place, like people just wanted to, do their own thing because it wasn't a very pleasant experience, as you can imagine. But despite that, people knew me as baby, like several people knew me. And then through that, their communities or their circles knew that. And the reason I bring this up is it made a lot easier for me to get in. And I didn't even join the group till 2012 because I'm here, and majority of the group, the nonprofit organization, the AIDCI, They reside in Toronto. And so for me, I think writing the book was a revelation, because it wasn't my story. It wasn't only my mother's story. It was a story of a community. But clearly, my being who I am makes it easier to enter all these things. And so I developed relationships with these folks in 2012. And so when I tapped into them in 2018, they were able to dive right in. They don't have to tell me what is going on. They know I already know. And so they were able to get in. And that's why you see the depths of the things that they talk about. I also traveled with them, and in some of them in 2015, and that's where we met Dilip. And since then Dilip's been a friend, and we talked about collaborating in 2017, and here we are. Dilip, do you want to talk about you? Like, Dilip took over on the all the historical background, which is very important, and nobody knows about it, and it's all about education.
Yeah, but you took over all the oral histories, which I was grateful for. So it was like we've said before, it was a really natural division of labor, if that's what you want to call it, because Joy had the in with the community, if you like, which I didn't feel I had. And even though I had done some writing before on the subject, and I'd gone and talked to a few people, but there was always a little distance, and naturally so. Why would they want to talk to me? And how long I was always faced with this thought of how long am I going to take to be able to win their trust and have them able to talk to me. So at the time, I was thinking that I need to do a little more writing, write a book about this. And I was faced with this question: what am I going to do about these oral histories? How am I going to get them? And that's when Joy suddenly appeared on the scene, and she had already done some oral histories, and so we talked about it and said, well, here it is. It's clear, you do the oral histories, and I'll do the historical and political background that you see in the book. So that was the division of labor, and then at some point we decided we had to think about how we're going to put all of it together. And one thought we had was that we'd bookend it, maybe have all the oral histories together in the middle, and then have some amount of history in the beginning and some amount of history at the end. But somehow that didn't seem natural. I can't explain fully why, but it just seemed like it would be a better read. I felt it would be a better read if we broke up the oral history, because they're pretty wrenching to read. And to read all of them together, I felt would just get overwhelming. So I thought it needed to be. We both agreed on that it needed to be divided up. We felt that would make the best organization of the book, and that's where that came from. And let me just tell you briefly about the text messages that you referred to. This is a person called Paul Chung, whom I visited in Calcutta in 2012 when I wrote my first article about this. Paul Chung has since died, poor fellow, but he's a well-known in the Chinese-Indian community there, and people told me I should go and meet him. So when I went there, and this is literally what happened. I mean, as I've written in the book, his phone there, he had a BlackBerry or something sitting on the coffee table between us, and it kept beeping, and he kept looking and saying, "Oh my God, one more and one more." So finally I said, "One more what? What are you talking about?" And he said, "There's somebody who seems to know that you've come to visit me." And he said, "I don't even know. I don't know this guy. I've met him once some time ago, and out of the blue, he's sending me these messages." And the messages were these almost incoherent, but sort of rambling diatribes, you might say, against, saying that you're giving away our secrets and people are going to come and they're going to take us into incarceration again. Don't talk to this guy, And it was really bizarre to be sitting there and watching these SMSs come in as we talked. And neither, of course, I didn't know where this was coming from, but oddly enough, neither did Paul. He couldn't understand how this fellow had found out that I was coming and why he was so disturbed by our meeting. But in the end, he told me, it's an indication of the climate of the sort of climate of fear that this community lives in. They're always afraid of something happening again. that 1962 is going to play out again. And this is just one indication of it. Maybe this guy's lost his mind to some extent, whoever it was. So that's about that. Joy, back to you.
Okay, so thank you, Dilip. So I think the other question you had, Lina, was about the term Deoliwallah and how we arrived at that. So a little bit of linguistics. So in Chinese, we have only one word for this type of thing. It's called Japchunyuan. And so it translates into concentration camp, and call it what you want, internment camp. And so when I was writing it, writing the book, I also had to come to a sort of a decision on what we wanted to call it. You know, and we went back and forth between concentration camp and internment camp, at least in my head. And we decided we would just do it internment camp because I guess we just kept people there, and you know, besides some strange things of you know, having it completely militarized and guarded at all times and playing music over the loudspeaker that you couldn't turn off, there wasn't any other kinds of concentration camp like activities, but also the whole Deoliwallahs, you know, so the people of Deoli, so the people who are trapped in this thing, it came about when we went to 2015 to our trip in 2015. There was Ying Marsh, Michael, Stephen, and me, and then that's where we met Dilip. And so we were talking, and then the word Deoliwallahs came up. Like, what do we call ourselves? And so we used that. We thought it was really appropriate to put the stake in the ground and say, you know, like, there is this history associated with Deoli, and since we were locked up there for a long time, it's appropriate for us to take this name. So that was on that topic. Dilip, did you have anything to add to that?
Just about Deoliwallahs, just that you know, you've explained. Wallahs just means people from. So it's like you might say, you know, Austinites or you know, New Yorkers or something like that. So this is just another way of saying it. But it in India, that's it's just I don't know. In some ways, like Joy suggests, it seemed to carry that particular weight that we wanted this the subject to have. You know, we want people to recognize that there is a certain weight here. This is not a trivial thing. This is something that we should be talking about, that we know about, we should know more about, and that word just seemed to capture it. The other thing I wanted to say is just to again repeat that what happened in 2015 was, to my mind, a fairly significant development in this whole history, because for the first time there were 4 Deoliwallahs who actually came to India and wanted to tell their story. As far as I know, that had not happened before, and they were open about it. And so I mean, I joined them. There was a series of meetings in Delhi where they just sat at a table. We showed a film about the incarceration, which features Joy and a few of the others. Then they just each of them told their stories, and there were questions from the audience. And I felt, and I really wish actually we could find a way to do more of those, but it means getting, you know, more of the Deoliwallahs to come to India. A lot of them are not in India, as it happens. So, but it was a very significant first step. So I'm glad that happened. What else?
There's some other questions, but I don't know. Do you want to take a question from Isabel or?
Let's just finish this last one if you don't mind. At least I think there was one more about this question of oral histories and how you handle those. I think that was the one pending, because then we'll conclude the recording and then move to an open Q&A and discussion with everybody, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's good. So I think, as I understand the question, it's about, you know, like how did I choose, you know, certain stories in the first person and certain person third person, and then Eva's story. So it was a bit difficult because oh, there's my brother. So maybe we can have him join. So mom's voice is very strong in my head, you know, like she's not a loud person, but she remembered everything. And so like I felt when I wrote that first story in 2012, for a long time we didn't want to talk about it because people are, we have family, and it's the long arm of government is a terrifying thing once you've gone through it. So my mom, I asked her, do you want to talk about it? And so she just told me, and I had heard the story so many times, but again, this like just and I just wrote it in one draft and I sent it in, and I think the publisher changed like one word, and that's because that word I used was cow dung, but I used the Hindi word, and so they changed it to make it more consumable by a global audience. And then for Yiva, we went to a little bit of a battle with the editors, and the editors wanted us to convert everything to the third person, right? And so oral histories were changed. But in Yiva's story, like Dilip and I talked about it, and we're like, she is so powerful. Like here's a millennial, not a millennial, millennial, talking about the weight of the history. And so we just thought it was best to have her own words. And I think some people see that as the apex, the core of the story, like everything winds around, like how it affects different generations. And then my own story was just in the first person. So I think, yeah, you can pick up the cadence of where Dilip writes and I write. And I think you really have to assess your audience too. Some of it is, the language and like, how you understand and translate from like Chinese to English and so on. So I think you have to kind of feel what the person's talking about to get the most out of how you present it. I know it's vague, but you just have to assess it.
Can I just say that a little bit again about Yiva, just to underline that? I don't know if it's clear that Yiva was not in the camp. She's the daughter of William Cheng, who was in the camp. And sorry, Michael Cheng. What am I saying, William? Yiva is the daughter of Michael, and so she born and grown up in North Carolina. And so what was really amazing to me certainly was after this Joy showed me this her history, her story was like Joy alludes to the weight that she was carrying of what her father had gone through and the effect that it had on her family. And to me, it automatically seemed like this really distilled the core of the book. It was, okay, of course you have stories from people who were in the camp, but to think that story and that baggage is gone a generation deeper, that really hit home to me. And I'm actually glad to see that it's not just us who see it as the core of the book. And I'm really glad that the people who see that as the core of the book and they don't see the other oral histories or some of the political background and all as the core. Yiva's story is really the heart of that book. It's the beating heart of the book, and I wish. I really wish if people pick up our book and read only one thing from it, if they should read Yiva's story.
Thank you all so much. We're very lucky to have William Ma, Joy's brother, join us. The internet is spotty, I gather, where he is, so we're going to take him while we've got him. So William, would you like to say a few words to the group?
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. And we've just had a festivity out here in Nepal. It's called Dasai, and the net people didn't come to work on things, so I'm actually on a data plan. And am I audible actually? Oh, great. Yeah, fantastic. Yes.
William, I just want to point out that that's you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for Dilip for showing that, Yes, I was a young boy who was just 1962, 63, that takes me, I was about 8 years old when we were incarcerated in the internment camp in Deoli. And one of the things that remains with me very powerfully is the the psyche of a young person, who had no idea what was going on. And, my parents tried to shield us from as many bad things as possible, and, the bad news as possible, and, not allowing us to feel guilt, because there was no guilt. And we were civilians. We had nothing. We were civilians. We had nothing to do with the conflict between the two countries. And from the eyes of a young boy, I remember very vividly the very stifling heat, the hopelessness of the situation, because as the years went by, it became almost like, has anybody from the outside world heard about our case? Do they know that we are incarcerated in this very very terrible and horrifying place? For a young boy, it was very difficult. For me, it was very difficult to make sense of it and to understand, and the understanding was, everybody has forgotten us in the world. Nobody cares about us. We are going to be left rotten, and there would be no recourse to any justice, or we would never be freed from this imprisonment. So that is the most searing memory I have of the place. And of course, the environment was very, very terrible, because it was really hot, stifling hot. There was no path to education. I was not educated for 5 years. And as we saw the numbers of the internees go down every year, every month, it was really horrifying. You have a sense of hopelessness, and you wonder whether you are going to end your life there. Your life is going to end there. So those are those memories are really deeply etched in my psyche. And I after having gone through that, I try to think of the positives, of course, and I think that it would be wonderful for the government of India to recognize that injustice was done to civilians. And the greatness of a nation is not about brushing things under the carpet, but is to acknowledge that wrong has been done and injustice has been done, and to speak about it, so that such things don't happen again. So that's all I wish to say at this point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, William. We really appreciate your joining us here. And I'll just end, before we move to the Q&A, just end with a big thanks to William, Joy, Dilip, and also to Lina. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate your comments today. We'll stop recording now. And we did have one, I think Isabel is in line in queue to talk. I'll just